So I'm at a spiritual gathering that starts on the 28th. There's a youth gathering going on now. I'm about to leave the hotel and go to the ashram and spend some time in meditation and just absorbing the transmission and all of the energy that goes along with the Sahaj Marg, the heartfulness spiritual practice. And the reason for this celebration now, this is basically a holiday for people who do heartfulness, and it's not celebrated through gifts or through materiality, but through the transmission process in these group meditations. And this transmission is really sublime. This is a special time, whether you meditate at the gathering itself. There'll be about 10 to 20,000 people here in Hyderabad at the ashram, Hyderabad. And people will do this all over the world as well. People will practice this system over a couple 100,000. And this person that is being celebrated is the second master, the first president of the Sahaj Marg system. Sahaj Marg means the natural path. And it's the Sri Ramchandra mission, which he named after his spiritual master and teacher. And it's now also known as heartfulness. Now, the first spiritual master was named Sri Ramchandra. He was named Ramchandra Lalaji, who I covered in an earlier video. And his successor was also named Ramchandra. Now, this is a very interesting story. The first master, who was affectionately known as Lalaji, and the second master was affectionately known as Babaji, lived in the northern part of in India in very rural villages. Lalaji lived in a village called Fatehgarh, and that's not pronounced correctly. And Babaji lived in this village called Shahjahanpur that were very close to each other. Now, these weren't typical people in the Indian culture that would be considered gurus. They came from castes that weren't usually castes that produced gurus. They lived in the northern part of India, not a place where normally gurus and people who ascended to high spiritual planes of existence would come from. So there was actually prejudice against them. And Lalaji had about 100 or so, maybe 200 or so people that came to his house. There was no mission, there was no organization, and he would transmit to them. And the method had not been clearly established. He would just transmit his love to them and affect them positively spiritually. It was just a village-based thing. The guys would come over to his house, people would come over to his house, and he'd transmit to them. That was about the size of it. And then some years towards the end of his life, this second spiritual master, this person named Sri Ramchandra, also Babaji, came to his house. Now, Babaji grew up, and very interesting figure. When he was a full-grown adult, he was about 5 foot tall, 5'2" tall, very slight of stature. He had basically a 6th or 7th grade education, and he was somebody that you would not notice. He was a very humble person. When he went to meet his spiritual master, he was the guy that sat in the back that nobody noticed, very small person. He grew up and he started to read about spirituality, and he decided that he needed to learn practically. He didn't want to read what other people wrote about it. He wanted to have practical experience of spiritual knowledge, that he would connect to God directly and get the knowledge directly from God. This is why he left school early. He came from a fairly wealthy family, and they thought he was sort of a failure. People didn't think that he would aspire to anything, and he was sort of ridiculed and teased a great deal in different ways. And he came to his spiritual master, he traveled to his spiritual master, and he sat in the back and was this unassuming figure. He was incredibly humble and simple, and he became a great meditator and communicator. And after his spiritual master died, when Lalaji died, 13 years later, I believe it was 13 years or 14 years later, he became his Lalaji's spiritual representative, because he formed such a strong connection to his guru. Very interesting kind of thing that happened here, that most of his instructions and most of his spiritual attainment that he was given to with his training by his spiritual master came years later after his spiritual master had what they call his Maha Samadhi, and he ascended to what is called the brighter world in the heartfulness tradition. So he connected to his spiritual master in spirit form. And Babaji was a great medium and meditator, and all of the great spiritual masters, Krishna, Christ, Buddha, Swami Vivekananda, and a host of all others communicated to him, blessed him. Of course, he was very humble. He asked permission. When Christians started to come to his spiritual organization, he founded the spiritual organization in 1945, and he went and he communicated with Jesus and says, do I have permission to impart spirituality onto people that practice your religion? And Jesus blessed him. Things like this. This is a very unique individual, someone who could communicate with people from a higher level of consciousness on other planes of existence, like he was just talking to somebody that walked into the room. And many of the people that knew him witnessed this. And so he was made into this very special spiritual personality. He lived in a very poor area in the world. He worked as a clerk. He had a job. He had a wife. He had children. He had 2 children that died. He suffered many of the things that people suffer from, problems that people suffer from. He actually had quite a number of really difficult problems, physical ailments and things like that. He had physical health problems. And he still aspired to be, he still reached a very high level of spiritual attainment through this process and became this just brilliant person, just radiating love and radiating light all the time. And so he was instructed to create this spiritual organization. It's called Sahaj Marg, which is called Heartfulness as well now. And he was instructed to transmit out to the world and affect world change through transmitting divine energy through his heart. So this is something that's very unique and interesting about the Sahaj Marg system. He didn't go and put up pamphlets and flyers. He didn't do anything that you'd associate with making something, now in the way that the internet works, the way that you roll something out. He didn't have a marketing strategy. He didn't do anything the way that normal people would try to bring people into an organization. He simply transmitted to people, which is very interesting. If you think about this, this is something where he called people to himself through his heart. And transmission, as he defined it, was the utilization of the divine energy for the transformation of man. It's a beautiful process. And so he transmitted to the West, to Europe, to America, throughout India, and people started to show up. Now, Indian people, a lot of them looked at this person that was slight of stature. He had a beard. He wasn't somebody that they would normally think of as a guru. He wasn't a Brahmin. He didn't associate with the Brahmin. He wasn't a part of the Brahmin caste where most of the gurus, most of the spiritual people come from. And so there's prejudice along this lines. He wasn't well educated, but he just radiated this love. And when they would go into group meditation, what we call satsang with him, they would meditate in front of him and he would transmit. He had these incredible sittings. And his successor, who I'll make a video about in the future, Parthasarthi Rajagopalachari, the person that I met, the person that taught me about spirituality through this process for the last 22 years, and he recently ascended to what we call the brighter world. Now, he was Babaji's disciple and his spiritual representative, and he talked about these people coming up from the south of India who are used to having climate around 80 degrees all year long, 80 degrees and up. So it was warm. And they'd go to the north of India. They'd sleep on a concrete floor with some newspapers, shivering all night. And they were just, the food. Babaji wasn't a wealthy man, and he was feeding all these people. They were staying at his house. He wasn't taking donations. So he was feeding, 20, 30 people that were sleeping at his house. And it was dusty, sort of, not a nice place, this village, and I'll describe this more in a second. And they would be sleeping on these cold newspapers, totally uncomfortable. and they would wake up at 4 and 5 in the morning, and Babaji would come out and give them a group meditation, and they were in heaven. I mean, it's just blissful experience that made these people come back for more and transform this, where now there's hundreds of thousands of people in India doing this practice. And then Babaji started to transmit to the West, to Europe, and to America. The person that started me was one of these people, hippies who are looking for spiritual enlightenment, started to come to India. And through word of mouth and bizarre circumstances, they would ride into this train, into this dirty, dusty village. It was full of dacoits, I believe is how you pronounce it, which are robbers. And they'd come in at 10, 11, 12 at the night, and they would get a rickshaw, and they were just lost in this village, and they would be brought to Babaji's house, and they would have these incredible experiences. And Babaji was this incredible, humble person, and he smoked a hookah. He barely ate any food, and he smoked a hookah, which is a water pipe that he would smoke tobacco. It had jaggery, some tobacco, jaggery, and coal, and they would light it and would puff this to hookah, and he would sit, and people would sit around him in a circle, and if you were a new person, he'd have you sit next to him, and he would stare at your heart, and then he would smoke the hookah and think, and he would look again and stare at the person's heart, and then he would look back, and then he would say very gently, "Now I'm on your case." Like he was reading their spiritual condition, he was reading their hearts, and he was coming up with a treatment plan. This beautiful process, and people said he would just look right through you, and you would just feel just enlivened, you would feel love, and you would just feel blessed. Tears would well up in your eyes, and it was just this beautiful process. People came to him and said, Babaji, I don't really feel comfortable having a spiritual master or a spiritual guru. This doesn't feel right for me, people from the West. And he said, well, a spiritual master, a spiritual guru is just a sweeper. So please accept me as your humble servant. And so he was like this kind of person. He was like almost like a Yoda-esque person. He talked in a very poetic way. He wasn't educated, so he talked from the heart. But through his spiritual practice, he could do everything. He could see everything. There was a person that came that was a scientist. Now this is way back in the 1950s or 1960s. And the person said, Babaji, what can you see? So this was a scientific person, and Babaji didn't know what this guy did for a living. He wasn't conscious of these things. But something in his heart told him what he needed to show this guy. So he thought for a moment, he prayed to his spiritual master, and then he drew a perfect example of an atom. He drew the nucleus of the atom and the proton, the electrons, and the guy was stunned. He said, how did you know this? This is stuff that they've just discovered recently. And he said, my Lalaji showed me, my spiritual master showed me. So he knew nothing of science, he knew nothing of what he was doing, but through a spiritual process, he could find any answer. He said so many beautiful things to people. People would say, one person said, Babaji, can you show me God? And he said, well, if I could show you God, how would you know it was God? And there was another young person that came from America and said, Babaji, I doubt the existence of God. And Babaji sat back and thought for a moment and said, who is this God who is not? And this is the way he answered questions and talked to people. He never chastised people publicly. He would give examples if someone needed some sort of correction. But mostly what he would do is pray and clean a person's heart and then transmit his love into them. He revolutionized the spiritual field. He brought about a new practice. The practice that heartfulness is now came from him. So he learned this system from his spiritual master and guru, but he's the person that registered and made this into a spiritual mission. He started to impart spiritual training around the world. He traveled around the world, and he won people's hearts. That's how he did things. He was a very quiet man, very humble man, and yet when people came into contact with them, they felt such love, they felt such bliss that they would go to all ends of the earth to find him and spend more time with him and have him impart his spiritual gifts into them. So this is a blessed time in our spiritual organization. I can already feel the quality of the sittings. His birth celebration is going to be on, it starts on the 29th of April, and the first sitting, I believe, is at 6:30 at night. So that's at the 29th of April, and then the 30th, which is his birth anniversary, there'll be 3 sittings, I believe, at 6:30 in the morning, 9 in the morning, and either 5 or 6:30 at night. The exact timings, I think, will be up on the website. Hopefully I'll find them and put a screenshot here so people can see the exact timings. And then as the final day is on May 1st, and there'll be a morning sitting, I believe, at 6:30 in the morning. So it's 5 group meditations. I would hope that people will be open and sit at this time in meditation and connect to this energy. It's just a blessed time. I should mention that often before these gatherings, and I've already gone through this, I used to get sick at every gathering, physically sick at the beginning of every gathering I went to. And especially around these birth celebrations, I've already gone through some physical things, and some negative emotions and thoughts would come out. And it's like poison being pulled out from my system. This is something that most people experience. So if you're feeling restless and uncomfortable, if you're a new person starting the heartfulness system, this is normal to the practice. But then as it's cleaning out stuff that shouldn't be there, so more love and light can be put in your system. And by the end of the system, by the end of the gathering, there's just a sense of upliftment. I can already feel the energy building. It's just a blessed time. I can't express enough how great it feels in terms of a heart-based level, just the love that's flowing through you. So I am sending everybody my prayers and the love that's being passed through me through this gathering. I hope people will benefit from this in some way, and that you'll all have a blessed celebration if you participate in this. It's just something I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to talk about this, because it's meant so much in my life personally, being able to do this system and associate with these people that have aspired to become these spiritual servants that serve God and use their life energy to help connect other people to God, the God that's within them, and pass this loving energy from heart to heart. All right, so this is just a story about Babaji. Maybe I'll do another video about him at some point, maybe next year, something. There's more information here. I'm leaving out a lot of things I can't really think of right now. But he was just a brilliant spiritual example of what a human being can attain if they take the right course of action and they live the proper way and they find a legitimate and effective system to connect to God, and they make that their goal in life. They make that their purpose, to connect to God and serve other people by doing God's work.